For decades, archaeologists have been puzzled by enigmatic desert mummies in northwestern China. Their western faces and sophisticated clothing suggested they were ancient migrants from distant lands. But in 2021, DNA analysis revealed something that would shock the scientific world. They weren't outsiders at all. They were descendants of a ghost population that vanished 10,000 years ago, and their discovery rewrites everything we thought we knew about human migration and civilization. This is a story that combines archaeology, genetics, history, and cultural studies into one of the most extraordinary narratives of human existence ever uncovered by modern science. It is a tale that challenges everything we assumed about how ancient populations moved, mixed, and maintained their identities across vast stretches of Eurasia. Let me take you back to the beginning. Imagine the Tarim Basin of Xinjiang province in northwestern China. This is one of the most inhospitable places on Earth. It's a vast, scorching desert surrounded by mountain ranges that form a natural barrier to the outside world. The landscape is brutal, unforgiving, and, for most of modern history, largely uninhabited. Yet beneath the sand and through the centuries, this desolate region has kept secrets that would eventually transform our understanding of ancient human history. In the early 20th century, European explorers and archaeologists began venturing into this remote corner of China. They were searching for evidence of lost civilizations, ancient trade routes, and the mysterious peoples who might have inhabited these harsh lands. What they found would become one of the most significant archaeological discoveries of the century. They found bodies. Not skeletal remains scattered in the dirt, but remarkably preserved mummies. The dry desert air had worked like nature's perfect preservation chamber. The bodies had been naturally mummified by the arid climate, protected in wooden coffins that looked like boats, buried with artifacts and provisions that suggested these were people of considerable status. The excavations intensified during the 1990s, when archaeologists systematically unearthed hundreds of these mysterious remains from various burial sites throughout the Tarim Basin. The most famous of these sites was Shaohe Cemetery, which yielded some of the oldest and best preserved mummies ever discovered. The excavations at Shaohe took place between 2002 and 2005, revealing multiple strata containing burials that ranged from 4,000 to 3,500 years before present. The sheer volume of material recovered from this single site provided unprecedented opportunities for archaeologists to study not just individuals, but entire populations and their cultural practices across generations. When scientists first examined these mummies, they were immediately struck by their unusual appearance. Many had light-colored hair, ranging from reddish to blonde hues that were not typical of indigenous East Asian populations. Some possessed facial features that seemed distinctly Western or European, with nose shapes and bone structures that resembled populations from the Caucasus or Central Asia rather than China. They wore finely woven woolen clothing that showed considerable craftsmanship, including felted materials, created through techniques associated with Eurasian pastoralists. They were buried with items like cheese, wheat, and millet, suggesting a diet and lifestyle foreign to the indigenous peoples of the region. Their graves contained pottery and artifacts that didn't match any known local tradition. Some graves included small statues and figures, including anthropomorphic representations and unusual carved objects whose purposes remain mysterious. Everything about them seemed to suggest they were outsiders, foreigners who had migrated into this isolated desert basin from somewhere in the West. This observation led to decades of intense speculation and debate among the scientific community. Historians and archaeologists proposed numerous theories about who these people were and where they came from. The most popular hypothesis suggested they were herders from the western steppes of Asia, perhaps descendants of nomadic peoples who had ventured eastward along the ancient Silk Road, seeking new lands and trade opportunities. Others proposed they were farmers from Central Asia's mountainous oases, people who had migrated across vast distances seeking favorable conditions for settlement. Some even suggested connections to European populations, theorizing that somehow these Western people had traveled across Eurasia and established communities in this remote Chinese desert. These theories engage with existing models of Bronze Age migration, drawing on evidence from other regions and archaeological sites. Scholars debated whether the mummies represented a single migration event or multiple waves of settlement. They discussed whether these populations maintained connections with their homelands or became entirely isolated from their origins. Some researchers explored the possibility of interactions between these Western mummies and indigenous East Asian populations, wondering whether there might have been cultural exchange, trade, or even intermarriage between these groups. These theories seemed reasonable given the physical evidence. The mummies' facial features did appear European. Their clothing and craftsmanship suggested Western traditions. Their burial practices and grave goods seemed foreign to East Asian customs. For over a century, most scholars accepted the narrative that the Tarim Basin mummies represented a Western population that had migrated eastward into northwestern China. This fit neatly into existing models of human migration and cultural diffusion across Eurasia. But there was always something troubling about this conclusion. If these people were relatively recent migrants from the West, why did they seem so culturally unique? Why did their traditions differ so dramatically from other known Western populations? How had they survived and thrived in such an inhospitable environment? And most intriguingly, why were they so isolated from other populations? The genetic and cultural picture simply didn't fit cleanly into the existing frameworks that scholars had constructed. As time progressed and technology advanced, scientists began to develop new tools for investigating ancient populations. DNA analysis, which had been refined over decades, now offered a revolutionary approach to understanding human ancestry and migration patterns. Researchers could extract genetic material from ancient remains and compare them to modern populations and other ancient samples. The development of next-generation sequencing techniques in the early 2000s had made it possible to extract and analyze increasingly complete genomes from samples that were tens of thousands of years old. This technique had already transformed our understanding of human history in Europe, Africa, and Asia, revealing unexpected migrations, population contacts, and mixing events that had been invisible to traditional archaeological methods. Now, in 2021, an international researcher team decided it was time to apply these cutting-edge genetic technologies to solve the mystery of the Tarim Basin mummies once and for all. The effort would require not just sophisticated laboratory equipment, but also careful methodology to avoid contamination and ensure the reliability of results. The research team was a collaboration of scientists from multiple nations and institutions, including researchers from the Chinese Academy of Sciences, Max Planck Institute in Germany, and universities across the world. Their approach was systematic and rigorous. They extracted DNA from the remains of 13 remarkably preserved mummies from the Tarim Basin, focusing on individuals dating to approximately 4100 to 3700 years ago. These were among the oldest mummies discovered at the site, buried in the early to middle Bronze Age. The selection of these particular samples was deliberate, as older samples would provide clearer insights into the original genetic composition of the population before potential later admixture with other groups. They carefully analyzed the genetic sequences, comparing them to vast databases of ancient and modern human DNA samples from populations across Eurasia. They examined both nuclear DNA, which is inherited from both parents and represents the entire genome, and mitochondrial DNA, which is inherited maternally and provides information about maternal lineages specifically. What they discovered was extraordinary and completely unexpected. The genetic results painted an entirely different picture than decades of physical analysis had suggested. The Tarim Basin mummies were not recent migrants from the western steppes. They were not descendants of Central Asian herders or European populations. Instead, their genetic makeup most closely matched an ancient population known as the ancient North Eurasians, or ANE, a mysterious group of hunter-gatherers who had lived across northern Eurasia during the Ice Age, roughly 10,000 to 20,000 years ago, or even earlier. The ancient North Eurasians had occupied territories from the Arctic regions of Siberia down through the steppes and into the mountain valleys of Central Asia. They were adapted to cold climates and were skilled hunters and gatherers who had thrived in environments that would challenge modern humans. They left relatively few archaeological traces, which is why their existence as a distinct genetic group had been largely invisible until DNA analysis revealed their fingerprints in modern populations. The genetic ghost of the ancient North Eurasians had been detected in modern populations through sophisticated statistical methods that could identify ancestry components in living people, but finding actual descendants living in the Bronze Age, Tarim Basin, suggested that the population had persisted longer and in unexpected places. To discover that descendants of this supposedly extinct population had somehow survived in isolation in the Tarim Basin well into the Bronze Age was unprecedented. It suggested a far more complex pattern of human migration and population persistence than scholars had ever imagined. The implications were profound for understanding how populations could maintain continuity through vast stretches of time. The genetic analysis revealed something even more fascinating. The mummies from opposite ends of the Tarim Basin, sites separated by over 400 kilometers of desert, possessed DNA so similar to each other that they might have been siblings. This genetic homogeneity suggested that the Tarim Basin population had remained relatively isolated for generations, not mixing significantly with neighboring populations despite their geographic proximity. They were not simply the result of migrations and intermixing. They were a distinct, isolated population that had maintained its genetic identity through careful cultural practices and perhaps even deliberate avoidance of other groups. This level of genetic similarity across such large distances indicated that the population had remained small and reproductively isolated, most likely through cultural practices that restricted marriage choices to within the community. Such practices are common in traditional societies and can include rules about acceptable marriage partners, endogamy, where individuals marry within their own social or ethnic group, and perhaps even geographic separation that limited interaction with outsiders. These social mechanisms would have been more effective than physical barriers in maintaining genetic boundaries. But here is where the story becomes truly captivating. While the Tarim Basin mummies remained genetically isolated and maintained their ancient North Eurasian heritage, they were not culturally primitive or resistant to change. In fact, the archaeological evidence showed they were remarkably open to adopting new ideas and technologies from their neighbors. The mummies wore finely woven woolen clothing of sophisticated design. They practiced dairy farming, making cheese from the milk of domesticated animals. They cultivated and consumed wheat and millet, crops that were not native to the Tarim Basin, but had been introduced through contact with other populations. They herded sheep and goats. They had developed irrigation systems to manage water in their harsh desert environment. They created pottery and other artifacts that showed considerable technical skill. This combination of genetic isolation with cultural openness is remarkable and distinguishes the Tarim Basin population as unique in the annals of human history. They were an isolated population genetically, but they were not culturally insular. They actively adopted beneficial technologies and practices from neighboring civilizations while maintaining their own distinct identity and ancestry. They engaged with the broader world around them, participating in the exchange of ideas and materials that characterized early Bronze Age Eurasia, while simultaneously preserving their own unique cultural traditions and maintaining their genetic distinctiveness. The discovery of milk proteins in the dental calculus of these mummies provided particularly striking evidence of this cultural adaptation. Dental calculus is the hardened plaque that accumulates on teeth over time, and it can preserve remnants of food consumed by an individual during their lifetime. The presence of milk proteins in these deposits indicates that dairy products were not simply occasional foods, but rather staples of the Tarim Basin diet. This suggests that the population had successfully adapted pastoral practices to the harsh desert environment and had integrated dairy farming into the core of their subsistence economy. The coffins and burial practices of these mummies also tell part of the story. They were buried in boat-shaped wooden coffins, an unusual practice that doesn't match known traditions from either neighboring West Asian populations or Chinese populations. This unique burial tradition suggests a distinct cultural identity, practices that had developed over generations within this isolated community, as if equipped for a journey in the afterlife, suggesting a sophisticated spiritual worldview and beliefs about the nature of death and the journey beyond. The presence of grave goods, including pottery, food items, and personal possessions, indicates that mourners believed these items would be needed or useful in the afterlife. This reflects a complex religious understanding that transcended simple materialism. The implications of these discoveries extend far beyond the Tarim Basin itself. The genetic findings force us to reconsider fundamental assumptions about human migration, population isolation, and cultural development in ancient Eurasia. For decades, scholars had largely accepted models of human history that emphasized continuous movement and mixing of populations. Trade routes, like the Silk Road, were thought to have created inevitable connections between distant regions, facilitating the flow of not just goods, but also people and ideas. The Tarim Basin mummies demonstrate that this model is too simplistic. Populations could remain genetically isolated for many generations, maintaining distinct ancestry and biological characteristics, even while being deeply engaged in cultural exchange with their neighbors. This suggests that human populations in the ancient world operated within complex social networks where trade, cultural exchange, and the adoption of beneficial technologies occurred regularly, but where deep-seated cultural practices, possibly including rules about marriage and reproduction, could maintain genetic distinctiveness. The discovery also raises fascinating questions about the ancient North Eurasians themselves. Who were these people, really? Why did they occupy such vast territories across northern Eurasia during the Ice Age? How did they survive in such harsh climates? And most significantly, how did a population thought to be extinct for thousands of years manage to persist in the Tarim Basin so far into the Bronze Age? These questions suggest that our understanding of this ancient population is still incomplete. That much remains to be learned about their history, their migrations, and their ultimate fate across different regions of Eurasia. The research team also examined genetic material from individuals in the neighboring Zungarian Basin, just to the north of the Tarim Basin. These remains, dating back to approximately 4,800 to 5,000 years ago, represented some of the oldest human remains ever discovered in the region. Interestingly, the Dzungarian individuals showed different genetic patterns than the Tarim Basin mummies. While they did carry some ancient ancestry, they also exhibited significant ancestry from the Afanasyevo people, pastoralists from the Altai-Sayan region of southern Siberia who had ventured eastward during the Bronze Age. The Afanasyevo themselves had close genetic ties to the Yamnaya, nomadic herders from the Pontic-Caspian steppe, located thousands of kilometers to the west. This genetic distinction between the Dzungarian and Tarim populations is significant. It suggests that while the Tarim Basin mummies represented a genetically isolated population descended from ancient inhabitants, the Dzungarian Basin was being increasingly influenced by westward migrations during the Bronze Age. These two neighboring regions, separated by relatively short distances, experienced fundamentally different demographic histories. The Tarim remained a stronghold of ancient ANE ancestry, while the Dzungarian Basin was gradually being incorporated into broader patterns of Bronze Age expansion and migration that originated from the western steppes of Eurasia. The linguistic implications of these discoveries are equally intriguing. For generations, linguists had hypothesized that the Afanasyevo people might have spoken languages related to the Indo-European family, specifically an extinct branch called Tocharian. The Tocharian language family appears in Buddhist texts from the Tarim Basin dating to around 500 to 1000 CE, suggesting that Indo-European languages had indeed reached this distant region by historical times. The new genetic evidence suggests that while Indo-European speakers of the Afanasyevo and related groups did establish themselves in the Dzungarian Basin, the Tarim Basin itself represented a distinct genetic and potentially linguistic zone that maintained its own ancient heritage, despite being surrounded by these expanding Bronze Age populations. This leads to a profound historical question. If the Tarim Basin population maintained its genetic identity and ancient ancestry despite being surrounded by populations bringing new languages, technologies, and ways of life, then what were the mechanisms that allowed this isolation to persist? Did the Tarim population speak languages completely unrelated to the Indo-European tongues that were spreading across Eurasia? Did they occupy territories that were naturally isolated from these expanding populations, protected by geography and climate? Or did they deliberately choose cultural practices that maintained their distinctiveness, even while adopting beneficial technologies? These are questions that remain partially unanswered, but they point toward a more nuanced understanding of human history than we previously possessed. The ancient world was not simply a stage for continuous migration and homogenization. Instead, it was a complex landscape where populations could maintain distinct identities while simultaneously engaging in meaningful cultural exchange and technological adoption. The Tarim Basin mummies represent a remarkable example of this complexity, a population that preserved ancient ancestry while embracing cosmopolitan culture. The practical challenges of survival in the Tarim Basin would have been immense. The region is one of the most challenging environments for human habitation on Earth. Summers are scorching, with temperatures soaring to extremely high levels. Winters are cold and dry. Water is scarce, available only at a few locations where underground sources reach the surface or where seasonal streams flow from the surrounding mountains. Vegetation is sparse, consisting mainly of hardy desert plants adapted to arid conditions. The population would have needed to develop sophisticated strategies for managing water, finding food, and protecting themselves from extreme weather. Archaeological evidence suggests they accomplished these challenges through a combination of strategies. They lived in shelters, possibly caves or rock shelters when available, which offered protection from extreme temperatures and from the harsh winds that sweep across the Tarim Basin. Some settlements were established at the margins of salt lakes and wetland areas that provided accessible water and attracted game animals. They practiced pastoralism, herding sheep, goats, and possibly horses, animals that could survive on the sparse desert vegetation and move seasonally to follow the available grazing resources. They cultivated crops near reliable water sources, using sophisticated irrigation techniques to channel water from these precious resources to their fields, demonstrating considerable engineering knowledge. They hunted game animals that inhabited the region, including deer, wild boar, and other fauna, adapted to desert and semi-desert conditions, relying on hunting to supplement their diet. They traded with neighboring populations, exchanging local products such as salt, preserved foods, and specialized craft items for goods and technologies from more favorable regions. This network of trade relationships was essential for obtaining raw materials not available locally. The evidence of dairy farming is particularly interesting in this context. Milk and milk products would have provided crucial nutrition, especially during seasons when other foods were difficult to obtain. The ability to produce cheese and other preserved dairy products would have created storable resources that could sustain populations through periods of scarcity. This suggests that the Tarim Basin population had not just adopted cattle herding from neighbors, but had integrated it into a comprehensive subsistence strategy specifically adapted to the challenges of their particular environment. The discovery of these mummies and the subsequent genetic analysis has implications that extend well beyond the specific case of the Tarim Basin. It fundamentally challenges our assumptions about how human populations behaved in the ancient world. It suggests that genetic, linguistic, and cultural boundaries did not necessarily overlap in ancient societies. A population could maintain distinct genetic ancestry while adopting foreign languages, technologies, and cultural practices. Conversely, populations with vastly different ancestries, like those in the Zungarian and Tarim basins, could live in proximity and maintain distinct identities. This has implications for how we interpret archaeological evidence from other regions and time periods. When we find evidence of cultural innovation or the adoption of new technologies, we cannot assume this necessarily indicates population replacement or massive migration. Instead, it may reflect cultural diffusion, where ideas and practices spread through networks of trade and communication without necessarily involving large-scale movement of people. This is a far more subtle and complex model of human history than we previously employed. The research also demonstrates the power of ancient DNA analysis in resolving historical mysteries. For over a century, scholars had argued about the origins of the Tarim Basin mummies based on physical features, burial practices, and material culture. These are all valuable forms of evidence, but they had led to conclusions that were fundamentally incomplete or misleading. Only when genetic analysis became possible could the true complexity of the situation be revealed. The mummies appeared Western in their physical features and cultural practices, but they carried the genetic signature of an ancient Eastern population. This contradiction resolved only through DNA evidence. As we contemplate what these discoveries mean for our understanding of human history, we must acknowledge how much remains unknown. The Tarim Basin mummies represent a unique snapshot in time, a glimpse of a population that thrived in one of Earth's most challenging environments. But their history did not end with the Bronze Age. What happened to this population in subsequent millennia? Did they persist into historical times? Were they gradually absorbed by neighboring populations? Did they maintain their distinct identity until relatively recent centuries? Archaeological evidence suggests that the Tarim Basin continued to be inhabited through subsequent historical periods. Trade networks intensified along what would become known as the Silk Road. New populations entered the region from both east and west. Cities and settlements flourished at oasis locations where water was available. Religions, languages, and cultures from multiple sources influenced the region. But whether the descendants of the Bronze Age mummies persisted through this entire process, maintaining some genetic or cultural continuity, remains an open question. Future genetic analyses of later remains from the Tarim Basin might shed light on this question. The story of the Tarim Basin mummies ultimately reveals something profound about human nature and human history. It shows us that our ancestors were not simple, undifferentiated populations, gradually spreading and mixing across the globe. Instead, they were complex societies with distinct identities, capable of maintaining cultural boundaries while engaging in meaningful exchange with the broader world. They were resilient, adapting ingeniously to harsh environments. They were innovative, adopting new technologies and practices when these proved beneficial. They were organized, establishing trade networks and social structures that allowed for exchange across vast distances. The Tarim Basin mummies challenge us to revise our understanding of the ancient world. They demonstrate that the conventional narratives we have constructed, often based on limited evidence and cultural assumptions, may be incomplete or misleading. They show the value of embracing new technologies and methodologies in archaeological research. And they remind us that the human past is far more complex, nuanced, and fascinating than our simplified models often suggest. In 2021, when these genetic results were published in the prestigious journal Nature, they captured the attention of the scientific world and generated significant media coverage. The discovery made headlines in major newspapers and scientific publications. Archaeologists, geneticists, and historians engaged in vigorous discussion about the implications. Some celebrated the breakthrough as definitive proof of complex Bronze Age population dynamics. Others urged caution, noting that DNA analysis alone cannot answer all questions about human history and that multiple forms of evidence must be integrated to construct comprehensive understandings. What remains undisputed, however, is that the Tarim Basin mummies have fundamentally changed our perspective on ancient human history. They have demonstrated that the ancient world was far more cosmopolitan and interconnected than previously believed, even as distinct populations maintained their identities. They have shown that cultural exchange and technological adoption could occur without requiring population replacement or large-scale migration. They have challenged assumptions about the relationship between genetic ancestry, language, and material culture, and they have opened new avenues for research and investigation into the deep history of human civilization in Central and East Asia. For students of archaeology, history, and human evolution, The Tarim Basin mummies represent a remarkable case study in how scientific methodology, interdisciplinary collaboration, and technological innovation can transform our understanding of the past. They embody the exciting possibility that further discoveries and analyses might reveal even more surprising truths about our ancestors and how they lived, adapted, thrived, and maintained their identities across the diverse landscapes of ancient Eurasia. They remind us that the past is never truly known, never completely understood, but rather represents an ongoing dialogue between the evidence that survives and the questions that scholars persistently ask. Each new discovery raises fresh questions and opens new lines of investigation. Each technological advance allows us to extract more information from materials we have long possessed, and each new insight fundamentally changes how we understand ourselves and our place in human history. As we continue to study these remarkable individuals who lived 4,000 years ago in one of Earth's most challenging environments, we are participating in an ongoing conversation with our own history. We are learning who we are by understanding who our ancestors were. We are expanding the boundaries of human knowledge and refining our models of how human societies develop, change, and persist through time. The Tarim Basin mummies stand as testament to human adaptability, resilience, and the remarkable capacity to maintain cultural and genetic identity even in the face of extraordinary environmental challenges and geographical isolation. And in doing so, we are honoring the remarkable achievements of these ancient people who survived, thrived, maintained their distinct identity, and left behind a legacy that continues to teach us profound lessons about our shared human heritage across the vast expanse of ancient Eurasia.